Have you heard the tragedy of Megaman X? It's not a story a Gacha player would tell. Megaman X is my favorite series of 2D side-scrolling platformers. I started with the original Mega Man on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and played all the way up until Mega Man 6. The series was simple. Fight robot masters, obtaining their powers, using those powers to defeat other robot masters who have a chain of weaknesses. Once you've obtained them all, go to some concluding stages where you have a bunch of unique challenges that are more difficult than the Robot Master stages. A few unique bosses followed by a boss rush of all the Robot Masters, and then a final boss fight wraps up the game. The series would add other staples such as companion powers like the Rush Coil and Jet, later the Charge Shot. I wouldn't come back to 7 and Rockman and Forte or 8 until much later on. While I enjoyed these games as platformers, they were quite forgettable for me. What stole my heart was Mega Man X. I was lukewarm on the game in the opening stage. Thought the wall climbing mechanic was overdue, sorely missed in the classic games. But what sold me on the X series was the conclusion of the Vile fight. You are pitted against a villain in a mecha robot who soundly defeats you. This wasn't done in video games of this era, outside of single-panel cutscenes or text dumps. So in the actual game, you are defeated by Vile, and then Zero comes in and saves you. This has been discussed to death on YouTube, but I'm going to repeat it because it's relevant to me. In the first game, Zero represents you, the player, that is to say the character X, at the end of his journey. He is a glimpse into what the player can become in terms of power. This locks in the player's motivation to play the game, to become as strong as Zero and defeat the guy who gave you so much trouble. A lot of the time a word gets thrown around known as ludonarrative dissonance. That is when the game's storytelling via game mechanics are at odds with the overt story that the game is trying to tell you, the player. You will, for example, get a lady who's washed up on an island, scared and alone. Then the player gets control of her, and the player is set about the task of bravely killing several dozen attackers before a cutscene makes her helpless and scared again. This has little to do with Mega Man itself, but it bears mentioning as it happens in video games all the time. Contrast this to Mega Man X, where the character's intention and the player's intentions are the same. They are married to one another in the sense that X needs to get stronger to defeat Vile and save the day. The player needs X to get stronger to defeat Vile and save the day. This is the power of a simple narrative. When you break down the actions that make up an enjoyable core gameplay loop, even for some of the largest, most expensive blockbuster games, the moment-to-moment gameplay tends to be simple and grounded. This is because games need to be accessible to a large audience as possible, and when you zone out potential players with too high a skill floor, you risk losing sales as a result, or damaging faith that the consumer has in subsequent products from that same company. So gameplay tends to be simple. The more complex you try to make a narrative, the more easily a simple gameplay loop will no longer accurately reflect that narrative. But we're still in the first stage of Mega Man X. Similar to the previous Mega Man series, the game allows you to engage in stages in any order you want, although the game is hoping that you will pick Chill Penguin. The Chill Penguin stage has an unavoidable capsule that you'll have to pass through in order to advance. This is a message from Dr. Light of the previous Mega Man X series, left for you, introducing you to a mechanic unique to the X series: armor upgrades. They will increase your powers beyond anything the world has ever known. Sounds pretty cool. So you take the upgrade capsule, and now you can dash and wall jump really far. When combined with the wall climbing mechanic, it increases your movement options to insane levels over the original Mega Man. And that right there is what solidified my love for Mega Man X. The speed and movement options you are granted by the feet part capsules. The rest of the capsules are hidden, by the way. You will be able to increase your defense power and your offense power to allow you to charge up and release unique versions of boss powers. That's a game changer as well. Each game in the X series grants you a different set of armor, with X5 and X6 granting you 2 different sets of armor. But in the first X game, the armor made you look a little more like Zero. In the classic series, not much changed about Mega Man by the time he was assaulting Wily's castle, whereas a fully armored X looks like an entirely different character by the time he raids Sigma's fortress. X. All of this plays into the power fantasy of becoming stronger to match Zero, while Zero makes his sacrifice to defeat Vile. You finish off Vile and go on to beat the game. X2 kind of misses the point of sacrifice by bringing Zero back, but it's done in a tasteful way that sells you on the power fantasy by allowing you to either have a fully powered Zero burst into the final fortress and kick butt, or if you fail to revive him, fight a fully powered Zero before restoring him to his senses. Either ending feels good. X3 overdid the complexity of the game by giving you selectable ride armor and chip systems to slot into your armor's helmet, all of which can go entirely unnoticed during a normal playthrough, and were wholly unnecessary by the game's difficulty curve. Despite that fact, X3 is the best looking the classic games ever got, because X4 would mark a departure from the classic style. The sprites were larger, and the result is the detail levels were all over the place. A lot of people say the X4 sprites are better looking, but the reality is, due to the change in art style, they were simultaneously better and worse depending on what you were specifically looking at. Mechanically, the game has you pick either X or Zero at the start of the game. Certain events would play out differently depending on which character you're playing as. Zero was seen by many as the hard mode of the game, but being a weirdo, I always felt like X was harder to play since you actually had to aim, whereas with Zero, you just had to get close to the enemy and make them dead with wide slashes. Regardless of your preference, the armor system was intact, but the clunky ride armor and chip selection systems were not included. A notable departure from X1 through 3, X4 featured animated cutscenes during gameplay that attempted to give context to what the player was doing. This did very little for X, but for Zero, he had an established relationship with a character who ends up dying during the game, massively coloring the experience. Other cutscenes for Zero cast light on his origins. In short, it feels like Zero got top billing in the narrative department and X was an afterthought. If you aren't using the undub mod from romhacking.net, you're also going to have some of the worst voice acting in video games in the Western version of the game. Moving along, X5 was the game that put narrative in the forefront, and things you did in the game started to be overshadowed by the cinematic story that was playing out. Unfortunately, the story didn't really grow in quality or complexity to match the increased importance the game puts on it. If you start as X, you get the 4th armor from the previous game, massively unbalancing the power curve in the player's favor over the previous games. Whereas if you pick Zero, you get the Zero Buster, which is not great. Between stages, you can switch characters. But X5 was the introduction of 2 sets of armor that the player could switch between stages, not counting the 4th armor, which brings the armor count up to 3. So with base form X, that gives you 4 forms to choose from. Now, X5 is not without its faults, and there's a mod known as the X5 Improvement Project Addendum that addresses almost all of them, turning a flawed but fun game into a tremendously enjoyable experience. Either way, the most standout feature of the game was the fact that a space colony was about to crash into the Earth, and the game had a timer that went down 1 hour for each stage you attempted, meaning that a game over would set the clock down an additional hour. The game had variable final encounters and endings depending on the choices that the player made. But at the end of the day, a lot of it came down to random chance, meaning you were incentivized to reload until you got the outcome you wanted. The intention of Megaman X5, artistically speaking, was to be the conclusion to the X series, as developers admitted, having X become the true successor to Zero after his final death. X carries Zero's saber with him in the ending. Sadly, regardless of what was originally intended, X6 was produced in a fraction of the time, and the game shows. Many of the stages in X6 are poorly constructed compared to the previous game, and the balance was poorly thought out. The standout gimmick for the game is a system that makes random stage effects occur, and it is horribly implemented. Now, there is a mod known as Megaman X6 Tweaks that addresses most, but not all of the major problems the game has. Unlike Megaman X5 Improvements Addendum, I consider the X6 hack almost required. Hats off to you if you enjoy this game in its vanilla state, because it's rough. From a story perspective, though, I love this game's setup. Whereas other games were set months or years apart from one another, X6 picks up 2 weeks after the bad ending of X5, where the space colony crashed into the Earth. The Earth is now teetering on the edge of extinction, with intelligent robots trying to repair the damaged environment. That's when a scientist robot named Gate touches a fragment of Zero and goes insane. Rather than just being a robot master, like the previous games, he becomes the mastermind, leading his own army of robots. Throughout the course of the story, a navigator character, who didn't get much characterization in X5, Alia, I like her by the way, explains how Gates' failures across his life led him to his unfortunate end. Unlike X5 and 6, the game felt really tacked onto the series, but it was enjoyable. Unfortunately, the game unceremoniously brings Zero back to you after you defeat Gates' nightmare reflection of Zero. The reasoning for this was they had just greenlit a separate series known as Megaman Zero, and they needed him to be alive to be awakened 102 years later for the start of that game. This was, once again, supposed to be the end of the X series. However, new deals mean newer games, and to showcase the effectiveness of the PlayStation 2, it was time for a 3D game in X7. This was the worst game in the franchise, and I recommend it to nobody. I do hope that, like with X5 and X6, one day it gets some form of improvement patches, but that's pie-in-the-sky thinking for how bad the game is. In a similar vein to how X5 was supposed to be passing the torch from Zero to X as leader of the Hunters, X7 was the introduction of Axel and the retirement of X. The idea is X becomes playable later in the game, but players are encouraged to try out Axel for the first couple bosses, and could always fall back on series favorite Zero if they didn't like Axel's style. The scrappy up-and-comer was supposed to appeal to new fans who weren't attracted to the straightforward X or the more serious Zero, but the game is virtually unsalvageable. From a story perspective, Sigma was up to no good again. A downgrade in storytelling from where the remains of Sigma were being used as Gates' fail-safe weapon in case he failed. So moving along to X8. Like X6, this game is very rough. It inherited the 3D graphics of X7, but instead of fiddling with 3D environments, this is a strictly 2D game. Being restricted to 2D massively improves the game over X7 already. However, the game's controls felt very floaty compared to the 2D games that came before. The introduction of the new generation Reploids and their leader Lumine takes what was a paint-by-number Sigma is at it again story and gives us a Mega Man X6 Gate-style twist at the end. But yeah, X8's plot hooks feel like they were born for either a sequel or tie-in media that never materialized. So that leaves us with the final entry in the X series, Mega Man X Command Mission, a turn-based Japanese role-playing game. With the exception of standout heroes like X and Zero, the game almost in no way resembles Mega Man X. It's a fun game, although extremely grindy. It takes place in the distant future, so there are almost no plot hooks. And due to the fact it takes place in the distant future, it may or may not contradict Mega Man Zero, which is absolutely fine. Honestly, more franchises need to take place in alternate timelines or what-if scenarios. That is prime video game landscape. But from there, we have other games only tangentially related to Mega Man X, like Mega Man Zero, ZX, Legends. They're all ambiguously set at some later point in the continuity. In short, Mega Man has a large pedigree of games, not including the legally distinct Gunvolt games by the creators of Zero and ZX. So when Capcom unveiled Mega Man XDive, a mobile game, I pretty much figured it was over for Mega Man. We're going to discuss that. I'm going to be overly negative for a while and save my praise for the end. You, the player, are transported into the cyberworld of Mega Man X's memories. If that sounds contrived or bad, that's because it is. It falls in line with a rather bad trope known as isekai, or otherworld story. The first major isekai that comes to mind is Through the Looking Glass, also known as Alice in Wonderland. But while that story has no overt purpose to it, The author said as much after writing it. We circle back around to the Japanese term, so we should look at Japanese media. There are way too many to count, so I'm going to pick 2 earlier examples, mostly at random. Now and Then, Here and There, and Vision of Escaflowne, 2 different series. Both of these stories have a lead character being transported into another world to undergo ordeals. Then upon concluding them, returning them to their original world as a stronger person for having undergone that journey, ready to live their life in the real world. What isekai has overwhelmingly turned into, however, is escapist fiction born from people who are not content with their real lives. An overwhelming amount of this genre have people using RPG systems from their favorite video games, like stats or levels, in order to give them a chosen one status in this new life, something that was denied them in the real world. In more Western media, we tend to use secret societies or hidden places within the real world as our setting for escapist fiction. This trope is referred to as the secret world, and is most prevalent within the wizarding world of Harry Potter, which exists as a projection fantasy for children. Regardless, Megaman XDive does not take place in the Mega Man universe, but rather a cyberspace where you, the player, will be endlessly referred to as Player San by the voice actress. I hopped into the game for a little bit and discovered it was a gacha game. I'll explain for those unfamiliar with the concept. In Japan, there are these little capsule toys, and there will be a display where you put money into, turn the crank, little egg comes out, they open up the egg, and find out what character they got. These exist in the United States, but are not anywhere near to the level that did in Japan. That's Gacha. It's official that I have absolutely no experience with these kind of things. Anyway, digital games, usually on mobile, are free to play, but contain these gacha gambling elements where you buy some sort of premium currency, then use that currency to buy pulls, like pulling the lever on a slot machine, noting that there's customarily, but not always, a bonus amount of luck weighted in the player's favor when you pull in groups of 10. These games often have limited time events or banners where a certain character or set of characters will be obtainable to create a sense of urgency, known as fear of missing out or FOMO. While all FOMO is technically bad, and games should stand on their own, I usually categorize FOMO into 2 categories. Unmonetized, as harmless motivation to play the video game, and monetized as predatory. So, story-wise, Megaman X Dive is a self-insert isekai Mega Man game, and the power gain is gated behind predatory gambling systems. I wasn't surprised, I was just disappointed. I gave it about 3 to 4 levels and determined that mechanically it played just like Mega Man X. I liked that. But I also looked at the prospect of a live service treadmill and the notion of being subjected to the desire to gamble for my favorite characters, and determined that the quality of the gameplay was not worth the potential costs of eventually succumbing to and buying those characters. And so I quit. The notice eventually came through that the game was being shut down. I started a complete replay of the Mega Man X games with the intention of looking at someone's long play or something in order to get the gist of the story of Mega Man X Dive, but then I ended up getting derailed with several other side projects. By the time I had finished up the X series replay, the announcement that the game was getting an offline version, I picked that up. More gacha games should have offline versions. For a game like Genshin Impact, you have a large enough fan base to have the cultivation launcher for the Grasscutters server emulator. But for smaller, less popular games, they don't get that kind of treatment and will languish forgotten when their servers shut down eventually. Live services that don't have any kind of contingency for end of life are truly horrible. One of several cases that can be referred to as death of games as an art form. Preservation of the arts demands that these live services get emulated servers. Alas, this will probably not happen for most of them. But back to Mega Man X Dive. So the offline version came out, I sat down, played it on live stream. Mechanically, it does feel like Mega Man X crammed into smaller bite-sized segments, perfect for a cell phone. Now, for someone who most recently finished Mega Man X 1 through 8, the stages were very unsatisfying, as even Gunvolt stages are much larger. The player versus player and co-op raid content of super bosses sadly did not make it over, but otherwise, the completeness of Mega Man XDive offline is pretty commendable. The story does feel pointless, as again, it does not take place in the actual Mega Man universe, but rather puts on a performance about taking place in the cyberspace of the real world, where the XDive characters are trying to make sense of the fragmented Mega Man memories scattered around the internet, and my place as Player San is incredibly off-putting. The story has the player battling corrupted data in the form of bosses, many of which are self-aware. As you correct the data, they are erased and the natural state of the Mega Man X series is restored. The twist comes in as they add brand new bosses who are characters in their own right, and that pulls on your heartstrings in order to get you to buy gacha pulls. Let me explain. So the primary thrust of the story is that when the deep log data is corrected, you've completed stages essentially, all the corrupted data will vanish, including the new characters, and that the new characters can be turned into hunter programs and therefore preserved past this correction. In addition to rolling for famous Mega Man characters and armors that you may have enjoyed in the past and may have an emotional connection to, for example, I really like Alia, she was the first character I grabbed, but instead of just doing that, now there are new characters that you get to know throughout the story, and it is implied, although never overtly stated, that unless you get them as playable characters, they will be lost when you complete the story. Therefore, you should preserve them if you feel for them. Now, in the offline version, of course, we buy them for premium currency we earn by doing missions. Therefore, we never have a state where we have to pay real-life money. The only cost in the offline version is buying the game. Now, it is never overtly stated, but by turning them into hunter characters, you create memories with them that will outlive the corruption. And the corruption is the Mega Man X Dive game itself. Basically, these characters were never meant to be part of Mega Man X, and now it's up to you to save them from falling into nothingness by gambling for them in the original version of the game. It's emotional manipulation. I don't mind the offline version since, again, the gacha gambling's been removed, but people were subjected to this for years of the game before it hit end of life. In the beginning, the emotional manipulation started in the form of the famous recognizable characters, and then later during events, limited versions of characters such as swimsuits or other themes, like Bridal Alia. Your waifu can literally be your waifu. The events thankfully have been preserved in the offline version as toggles the player can do on the menu at any time, meaning that it acts like a time capsule for preserving those extra game stages and rewards without the fear of missing out, or FOMO, that the original game had. For the majority of the game's lifespan, the mechanical design of characters were overly balanced, but got progressively broken as the game eventually reached end of life in order to extract more and more money from players, especially as the game's player base declined. You won't really see a reason to have these broken, overpowered characters in the base game of Mega Man X Dive Offline, but the online version had PvP and co-op raids that would leverage them. Speaking of manipulation, let's discuss the game's power systems, which in an offline, free-to-play state I actually found quite enjoyable, but would be a true hell on earth if this stuff was still monetized. First are your characters. Originally, you had to roll for these characters not once, but in the style of gacha games like Genshin Impact with its Constellation, it's official that you would have to roll these characters multiple times to unlock skills inside of them. Now it's just buying them from the store repeatedly. But back then, it wasn't enough to just roll Ferrum from Mega Man X Command Mission, although that is a really nice art piece you got there. You have to roll for her until you unlock the power that makes her blood aura heal herself when an enemy gets damaged by it. And now the game is 80% easier. Same with event characters like Riku. Pretty good design, I love those skirt vents. She's pretty spammy with her own base skills, but level her up and she's healing herself like crazy and is nigh unkillable. But really, a healing character subverts the entire point of the stages and subsequent mid-boss and main boss fights, which are supposed to be perfect execution and endurance. So yeah, I cheesed the hell out of them. Anyway, getting these characters and their special abilities all leveled up is easy in the offline version, where you only need to do stages to earn premium currency. But in the online version, you had to entrust your fate to the gambling, spending hundreds or even thousands of dollars to hit something meta. I mentioned Genshin earlier because unlike most gacha games, where you select a move and watch a PNG perform that move, the characters in both Genshin and Megaman XDive actually change how you play. They aren't just PNGs, but rather play styles you unlocked and upgraded. And oh boy, did you upgrade them? Between investment in their skills, ranking up their powers, rolling duplicates of them, using cards, and DNA codes at high levels, there were a ton of obfuscated power systems inside of a single character that could keep you busy for a long time. All of this became instantly enjoyable when online turned to offline, and you could just run missions to get upgrade currency instead of paying for it or getting a daily login bonus. In the offline game, the levels themselves were pretty well tuned for a not fully upgraded character, and the stronger tier characters were gated past a certain level of main quest progression, meaning you couldn't get the XDive Next armor with the ultimate buster until the end of the game. Speaking of busters, separate from characters, the game also has its own weapons. In addition to leveling them up, you had to roll for duplicates, unlocking a skill tree, inserting chips. Functionally speaking, they had just as much upgrade complexity as characters, despite being a single button press to attack. Just like characters, different weapons would perform differently with unique projectiles and such. Picking a good weapon was more than just raw damage numbers, although the fact you invested so many resources into one meant it really hurt when you wanted to upgrade to something objectively better. The game doubles up on that investment by forcing you to have a primary weapon and a sub-weapon. Both contribute to your overall power. Oh, I didn't mention that, but you have an overall power chart to define how strong you are. You want all of these categories at the bottom to be as high rank as possible. So other categories are your limit break or ultimate, known as the dive trigger, which has its own skill tree and its own upgrade currency and its own duplicate ranks where you want to roll for duplicates. The chip category allows you to add special effects to your character and weapon. Again, leveling and merging duplicates like anything else. Finally, armor rounds the whole thing out, making absolutely no cosmetic change to your character. The armor is purely to reinforce your stats. You can upgrade your armor significantly, but really every 5 to 10 levels you're going to want to craft an entirely new set of higher tier armor. Yes, there are 2 tiers, high and low. And then after crafting that set, you're going to want to upgrade it fully, then repeat the process 5 or 10 levels later. In the offline version of the game, I actually like running those upgrade missions, then clicking the button to watch my overall power go up. The Skinner box systems are actually quite enjoyable when they aren't tied to cynical monetization. I remember when someone got mad at me for enjoying Vampire Survivors on stream, which is a dopamine hit simulator most of the time. Why not? It's fun. The most important thing in video games is to enjoy yourself. Clicking all the buttons and watching the numbers go up, then testing those numbers in a Mega Man X level, that was really fun. RPG players do this all the time, seeing their numbers go up and then testing it in combat. Not all RPGs are even a thinking person's game. Many are bare bones dungeon crawlers or adventure games with RPG progression mechanics incentivizing taking your time instead of rushing through the game. What I'm trying to say is that these systems are not inherently bad forms of enjoyment for those who do enjoy them, provided you divorce them from predatory forms of monetization. Mega Man X Dive Offline gives you that. But yeah, in its original incarnation, it was the scum of the earth mobile game designed to extract as much money from you as possible while giving you the bare minimum Mega Man X experience. So as you progress through the levels, the characters that talk at you at the beginning of stages will occasionally suggest that you dip out and do certain events. These are rewrites for the offline version because when the original game was running, it released content in waves, and those events happened between waves. That means that plot details were hinted at or revealed prior to those parts of the game. And you can follow along just like the online players did by going and doing those events before you go back into the stage and finish it up. Now, I'm going to be real with you for a second. The entire story is horrible, and there is almost no value in doing these events in order, even though I did. But by this point, the game's original non-Mega Man X characters have started popping up and adding flavor that has, by this point, almost entirely washed away the atrocious isekai flavoring that the start of the game had. While there are no stakes for the player, since these are just the memories of Mega Man and not an actual Mega Man game, they start telling a meta story where we need to preserve these new characters, not let them get deleted when we defeat them. I mentioned earlier that this meta story was emotional manipulation designed to get you to gacha pull for them, and while that's still true, the interplay between these characters hits right to give you what was originally a pointless game some point and purpose. There are now stakes, and it becomes important to see Riko's mission through to the end. And when you do finish her mission, the music and presentation make that moment genuine. In the same way that the original music, not the butchered Kai version, of Dragon Ball Z makes Gohan's transformation to Super Saiyan 2 genuine, despite the entire setup being horrible if you think about it at all. The moment was great. But yes, genuine feelings for Riko now that her mission is done. You have a save file that has the completion tag, and you are allowed to keep playing, even though they never progress the story any further. Now that Riko's job is complete, more events were added, and those events are playable in the event log. For the people who kept playing after the story was complete, events and characters would come out increasingly broken, overpowered, in order to get people to come back to the game. 5 different people told me that they interpreted the events as Riko coping for the fact that her friends are gone now. Well, that certainly wasn't the intent of the material. You can really view the Mega Man XDive original characters like author inserts for the staff who made the game in the first place. They know they don't belong in Mega Man X. The mobile game they created was in many ways authentically Mega Man X, and especially in ways that are counterintuitive to making a profitable mobile game. It appeals to niche fans of the Mega Man franchise, which sadly peaked a long time ago. The number of people who would be attracted to this game based on its own merits to become Mega Man fans in a sort of cross-pollination is practically non-existent. Whereas during their height, older mobile games that featured practically no dynamic gameplay at all were capitalizing on cross-pollination with their brands. A couple examples would be Fate Grand Order and Magina Record. But Mega Man never had any other concurrent properties to revitalize at the same time. It's entirely possible for Capcom to reverse course on this eventually, but in XDive's current state, Mega Man XDive Online was an end-of-franchise money grab with a post-life offline zombie cash grab. And it's a real shame because these character designs were wonderful. I would love to have a spin-off game using Iris Another or any of the dive form designs. Sure, this is all fuel for fan games, but even those seem to be more tightly focused on the SNES Mega Man X entries. But for me, I've moved on with Inti Creates. They've originally made the Mega Man Zero series and have since made their own spiritual successors in the Gunvolt and Avenger X spin-off series. Other indie companies have also picked up the torch, creating games like Lunar Lux for fans of the Battle Network series, and Gravity Circuit for fans of the Classic series. That's barely scratching the surface on how indie games have taken a "you won't make Mega Man, so we'll make our own" stance. The sad reality is Capcom could easily do a Sonic Mania with the sheer talent that exists within the fan game space. They just choose not to. But moving along, I've got more topics to touch on when it comes to XDive. First and foremost, the campaign levels of the game also have a challenge difficulty. Infuriating enough, these do not give standard rewards, but rather different ones, meaning that completion of all challenge stages is not something you can do naturally as a higher skilled player or a more prepared player, and they will not give you experience points or progression through the stages. Rather, it's a time sink to do all on its own. Now, setting aside that annoyance, the challenge stages are actually quite fun to play, and I enjoy playing challenge difficulty through all the stages of the game. You can still utterly break these with some characters, and I feel that's actually an appropriate way to moderate difficulty in a game like this. Let the player do it with their own choices. Challenge mode also applies to all events I looked at, meaning you can push pretty hard, as some of these events were released after the game's story. Next up is the Jacob Elevator. If you want a certain chip or other rewards without farming the same bosses over and over, this is how you do it. The Jacob Elevator is an escalating series of challenges separate from the core progression of the game, and presents you gauntlets of enemies, punctuated with combat challenges. I didn't do a whole lot of it, and there is a whole lot of it to do. Finally, there's race mode. Didn't do it past the first level. Sorry. Didn't do it for me in Sonic the Hedgehog either. So to wrap this up, I really enjoyed the various events. I enjoyed the challenge mode. I thought the story was stupid, but the ending felt great. I wish these character designs could make their way into a future Mega Man X title, even if it was some inane spin-off, not a serious game. But I don't hold out hope. Okay, bonus round. Mods. Capcom's R&D has drawn a line in the sand against mods, saying that it causes them to lose control over how their brand is represented. This is true when a professional fighting game tournament contained a completely naked Chun-Li. But that is the risk you have to take if you are going to leverage mods and make it big. The single largest way to garner goodwill and loyalty toward your company is to make a good game that people enjoy playing. Making a good game is almost a sure thing if you know what you're doing, have skilled designers, and a strong creative vision powering the entire thing. The second part, ensuring that people enjoy playing the game, is a wild card that no one has nailed down. When a company gets complacent and thinks they can repeat the same formula forever with an escalating investment, those investments eventually don't get the kind of returns they want after a certain limit. Whereas random indie games such as Pal World suddenly materialize and pull in an audience, greatly eclipsing their original investment. A lot of people in marketing have a lot of different ideas on how to draw in an audience, and while I respect their opinions on that point, on the flip side, if an executive who's come up through the sales and marketing, they likely have no idea at all how to retain users and foster goodwill in the community. This is the arena they need to be booted from in the decision-making process. Mod support inspires more goodwill and brand loyalty than anything the company could do beyond just making a good game. You still have to make a good game, so this is additional goodwill and brand loyalty. If your game was made in Unity or Unreal Engine, people can access the software development kits for those two engines for practically free, and therefore mod support need not be an elaborate or costly process, merely a consideration from the start of development where the file formats need to be kept fairly transparent and hooks be added to the menus for custom content and scripts to be loaded freely. A quick pop-up saying we do not take responsibility for custom content and you're good to go. Mega Man X Dive Offline did not receive any sort of support for modding, so the scene had to develop on its own. The game was made in Unity, so the aforementioned software development kit was at people's disposal. As a result, cut content was reinstated, new characters were added, raid content was restored, only for single player. Many customizations were made to the game, to the point at which a couple people, seeing what kind of mods were available online, actually bought the game just based on the mods alone. Even without mods, though, I went from only partly enjoying Mega Man X Dive to fully enjoying it by the end. Completely vanilla, no mods. If you are a Mega Man fan, I'd say give Mega Man X Dive Offline a go when it's on sale. Ignore the story. Enjoy the characters, stages, battles. If it's too easy, pick some lower-powered characters or weapons. Do some challenge modes. The game is a little theme park of nostalgia, provided you don't take it too seriously. Capcom, start licensing some of those fan games for official release. And for the rest of you, thanks for watching. I'll do some more rambling soon. See y'all next time. Remember us. That's it. Deep log corrected. Isn't it? Oh. Credits? Credits? Really? Okay, that's pretty damn cool. And now the kiddo that you were supposed to be playing as, the guy who got isekai'd into the Mega Man world, gets up and leaves. That's it.